So hello everyone, this is part one for our Tuesday talk series that we're coming to you live on Facebook. So hello friends. So today I have with me is Marcus Aguilar. So Marcus is a senior research engineer in the City of Roanoke's stormwater utility. His expertise is in understanding and improving the long-term interaction between humans, our built infrastructure, and the natural ecosystem in urban watersheds, using innovative engineering, economic, and policy tools. Marcus received his PhD and MS in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Virginia Tech and a BS in Civil Engineering from the University of Alabama, and is a licensed professional engineer in the Commonwealth. He has over 10 years of experience in water resources, consulting, academia, and local government, and is the author of numerous journal articles, conference proceedings, and technical reports. So today, Marcus is going to talk about flooding in Roanoke. So Marcus.
Thanks, Danielle. And please let me know if there's anything I need to do. If the audio is not good or anything, just give me the, give me the pause. So thanks for the introduction and good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to have an opportunity to present to you all today. As Danielle mentioned, we're going to be talking about history and a little bit of kind of background about the Roanoke Valley, and also with respect to flooding, the path forward, some of the things that we have done to address flooding issues in the valley, and some of the ideas and projects that we have moving forward to address flooding as well. So first, we're going to start with some history. We're going to take a step back into the mid-1700s and kind of look at the development of the Roanoke Valley. After that, we'll talk about sort of flooding in general, so urbanization and floodplains, and how those two things combine to cause flooding in urban areas. Next, we'll talk about the stormwater utility here in the city. So the team that myself and Danielle work on, sort of the different projects that we're working on for flood mitigation. And then at the end, we'll have time for questions and discussion. And I hope that you all will have some. Look forward to interacting with you all over the presentation. So let's get started. Okay, this is I'm taking a big picture approach here first. So we're going to talk about the Roanoke River Basin or watershed. So what I have shown on the screen here is the watershed, the entire watershed that drains to the Roanoke River at Albemarle Sound in North Carolina. So here's the sound down here that drains off into the Atlantic Ocean. And the areas that we're familiar with, the river obviously starts way up here, up by Blacksburg, and we'll zoom into this here in just a second. Flows on down through city of Salem and Roanoke, through town of Benton, and then on down to Smith Mountain Lake, where it meets up with the Blackwater River. The river then proceeds on down to meet up with the Dan River and then flow into Kerr Reservoir by the North Carolina border, and then on down to the Sound. So the area that we're going to kind of zoom into here in a second, we call it the Upper Roanoke River Watershed. It's really, as you can see here, it's really the top or the upstreammost reaches of this broader river basin. Just wanted to give you all some bigger hydrology context for the talk today. So let's zoom in on this one particular area here. All right. So this is the Upper Roanoke River Watershed, outlined in red. And this is the area of land that drains to the Roanoke River immediately upstream of Back Creek. Okay, so some of you all have been over to Back Creek. This does not include the area, the watershed that drains to Back Creek. It's just the area upstream of that. And it's a little bit more than a 500 square mile area. A couple things that I think are interesting to note about that are really important is the sort of the folded streamlines that come out of this watershed. So what I mean by that is, for example, the North Fork of the Roanoke River has this really long curve out of the Ellet Valley. It starts kind of actually going the opposite direction towards the southwest, and then takes a sharp turn where it meets up with the South Fork of the Roanoke River at Lafayette, which is near the Roanoke exit on Interstate 81. Once it passes through there, it proceeds on down through the Interstate 81 and Highway 11 corridor through the city of Salem, where it meets up with Mason Creek from the north, proceeds on down through Roanoke City. We've got about 10 miles of Roanoke River here in the city. In our area, we pick up drainage from Peters Creek to the north, Mudlick Creek, and various other tributaries to the south. And in addition to that, we pick up Carbon Creek and Tinker Creek, also from the north, draining Troutville and Botetourt County, and then Glade Creek from the northeast. So when you look at these arrows, it's interesting to see how the streams all sort of fold around the mountains and converge really on the flat bottomlands around Salem, Roanoke City, and Minton. And that's a really important piece of information to remember. Upstream of us, we have these really steep mountains, and we have these small mountain streams that are, when it rains, the water drains off of them really quickly and converges on this urban area in Salem and Roanoke and Minton. And so that's sort of a backdrop for some of the causes of flooding here in the Roanoke Valley. Okay, so now that we've kind of defined the Roanoke Valley, i.e. this is the area that we're going to be talking about today, let's talk about a little bit about some history of the region. And we'll pull these threads together here in a couple of slides. So up until about the 1740s, our region really was forested. There was hundreds of square miles of beaver dams impounding various tributaries and waterways, forests, really not a whole lot out this way. And around the 1740s is when folks came over from the James River Basin and started really developing the landscape. And by developing, I essentially mean agriculture, right? At that time, it was the early years of tobacco growth and various other types of small-scale agriculture here in the valley. In the early 1800s, small settlements started to pop up around our area. So for example, on the right-hand side of the screen here, I have a sketch from Bruce's history book, published in 1942, showing the Trout House, which was sort of a tavern and an inn. And it was located near the intersection of what is now First and Campbell downtown. Okay, so what I think is cool about that graphic is it's essentially a field with some trees, and you've got this, this one single house, and now kind of go in your mind to what First and Campbell looks like now, right? It's a dense urban center with roads and big buildings and so forth. But this was really the beginnings, the genesis of Roanoke in its youth. And as the 1800s proceeded, we saw these settlements growing. So we saw people moving from farms into cities and engaging in different types of businesses and commerce and industry. And then in 1884, we see Roanoke chartered as an independent city for the first time. And so that was kind of the early years of Roanoke. Between 1880 and 1960 is really when we saw the population of the city growing roughly at 1,000 to 2,000 persons per year up through the 1960 census. Okay, so you can see some steep growth here in Roanoke City's population. After 1960, the population here in the city has more or less reached steady state at around 100,000 persons. Okay. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that with the growth of cities, the increasing population and the rising density here in Roanoke, but also everywhere in the US, one of the things that goes with that is the construction of infrastructure. So houses and buildings and roads and bridges and everything that you all know as a city goes with it, right? As the population grows, the development of land goes with it. So now we're gonna talk a little bit more about the drivers of flooding. Why does flooding happen, and why is that connected with urbanization? Okay, so what I have shown on the screen here is what the Roanoke Valley would have looked like back in, say, 1730, right? So a lot of grassland, a lot of trees, the soil that had been developing in the land over hundreds of years. And when development happens, move this out of the way. When development happens, the rain that falls on the landscape it's sort of diverted in different ways. Okay, so when we start building on a given area, a watershed or a parcel or whatever, the first step is that typically the vegetation is removed. Okay, so that's the first thing that happens. Next is that soil is compacted in order to allow for the construction of buildings and roadways and so forth, so it has a stable base. Okay, so with that, of course, we see an increase in impervious cover. So rooftops and, as I just mentioned, driveways, sidewalks, etc. Okay, and when that happens, when all of those three things happen, what we get is more runoff more quickly. Okay, so in the graphic, when we move from undeveloped, say forested land to a developed area, if you think about rainfall as 100% or the full pie, under an undeveloped condition, we would have about 10% of that flowing off of the surface as surface runoff. As you start to develop and engage in these different land development activities, a larger percentage of that rainfall is starting to appear as surface runoff. So less of it is going into the soil and infiltrating into groundwater, and less of it is available for evapotranspiration up into the atmosphere. So you guys know when it rains on a really warm day, usually when it stops raining, you can see like these almost clouds of steam and smoke going back up into the atmosphere. That's evapotranspiration. As we continue to develop an area into denser residential communities and even into, say, our central business district, what we see is a continued increase in the relative proportion of that surface runoff. So under the forested land condition, maybe 10% appears as surface runoff. When we talk about dense urban areas, we're talking more about 50% or potentially even greater than that appearing as surface runoff. So again, more runoff more quickly. Another thing that's really important to understand is that here in the US and actually globally, urban settlements have historically sprung up around bodies of water, so rivers and streams and springs and lakes and so forth. Now the reason for this historically was, number one, settlers needed a drinking water source, right? So they had to have a place that had fresh water to drink from. Before the advent of wastewater treatment plants and sewage plants, rivers were actually used as the way that you got rid of human waste, right? So there had to be some way to get rid of that. And so it was dumped in the streams and just conveyed off downstream. In addition to that, some of the bigger rivers here on the Atlantic seaboard, and of course the Mississippi River, were important for navigation for commerce. So if you can imagine, it makes sense to put a settlement right up against a river, because it means you can get the boats with the cargo directly up to the cities that are inland. Another important factor is that here on the Atlantic seaboard, we had a lot of mills that were used for refining in various types of industries. And so all that's to say that rivers and streams here in the US have historically been the center of urbanization and land development for these various reasons, right? And so here on my screen, I have a photograph of Houston during Hurricane Harvey. Okay, so I grew up in Houston, so this is kind of near and dear to my heart. And sort of what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that historically we've developed along rivers, but we also historically have seen extreme flooding, right? And so while these extreme floods are rare, typically they're also a normal process. And because we've built cities essentially right up against rivers, this creates this tension, this problem, right, between the development of land, the building of cities, and this normal process that's flooding. Okay, and so to summarize, we have these two things happening, right? We have the growth of population and development here in the US and of course here in the Roanoke Valley as well. And the sort of the very nature of development in that we lose vegetation, we lose the soil's infiltrative abilities. That exacerbates a problem that already exists because of the fact that we've built cities very close to rivers. Okay, so let me close this slide by saying that some researchers found that the memory of extreme floods typically lasts about 25 years. Okay, so when a really bad flood happens, like Hurricane Harvey, for example, one generation experiences it, they engage in all sorts of activities to address the issue, and then the next generation down the road forgets that it happens. And this is really typical of rare but really high damage events. And so what I want to do next is talk a little bit about the sort of the biggest flood here in the Roanoke Valley. So this is kind of hey, let's remember the flood of '85, right? Because I was born in 1986. I don't even remember this flood, but many of you guys that are on the Facebook Live potentially did experience that. So the flood of '85 was an artifact of a hurricane that came up from the Gulf of Mexico through Louisiana, Hurricane Juan. Leading up to the hurricane's remnants here in the valley, we had a couple of days of rainfall saturation up in the watershed. So the area that I showed you on the second slide of the presentation, we had a couple days back to back of rain, and that rain really filled up all of the soil's infiltration capacity. And so on November 4th, when we received 6.61 inches in 24 hours, that really meant that the rain had nowhere to go but run off, right? So it went directly into the streams, directly into the Roanoke River, as I showed on the earlier graphic, and ended up here at the bottom in the valley in the urbanized areas. So several people lost their lives. There was an enormous amount of property damage that was associated with this event. The USGS records it as a 175-year flood, so greater than a 100-year flood. And another thing that's important to remember is that downtown during this event actually flooded twice. So the first time it flooded was actually Trout Run, the small little tributary that runs underneath downtown, actually underneath Campbell Avenue. When it started raining, it flooded pretty quickly, and then the floodwaters went back down. And then several hours later, the river came up and actually found these various openings that the floodwaters were able to make their way into downtown and flooded a second time. Okay, so in response to the flood of '85 and various other floods that happened in the '70s and '80s, the Corps of Engineers in partnership with Roanoke City constructed what we now commonly call the Roanoke River Flood Reduction Project. The project was a $72.5 million effort, and it was built between 2004 and 2012. The photograph here on the right is a construction photograph from our city engineer's office showing the construction of what we call floodplain benches. So the idea with these benches is that when the river comes up, it spills over into these benches where, it's just grass and not really much there, but it doesn't cause any damage, right? There's no structures or development there. It's just open floodplain space, right? Another co-benefit of this, of course, is the greenways that we all use and have come to love here in the valley. So in addition to these benches that they built, they also widened the channel over about 6.2 miles. So there's 10 miles of Roanoke River in the city, and about 6.2 miles of it was actually widened out in footprint view. And then for those of you that have been to River's Edge Park, you've probably seen the concrete training walls that sort of come up out of the ground a little ways. Those are also part of the flood reduction project's efforts to keep floodwaters within the river's footprint. A piece of information I think is really important about the flood reduction project is that it was designed to convey approximately the 25-year or 4% annual chance flood, not the 100-year or 1% annual chance flood. If we were to build something that tried to convey the 100-year flood, it would obviously be many times more expensive than this, and the size of it would be really enormous. Okay, so kind of an important fact to understand about the flood reduction project. Okay, so in addition to the efforts associated with the flood reduction project, the city also understood that here locally we had a need to build and maintain storm drain infrastructure at a really high level because of our susceptibility to flooding. So here in the City of Roanoke stormwater utility, we have what we call 3 legs of the stormwater stool. So the first is storm drain infrastructure capital projects. So we have this list of 210 projects valued at $140 million that we're all the time working towards. We've got a great capital projects team that's planning for and designing and building these projects to keep our neighborhoods and streets flooding adequately. In addition to that, we also have about 300 existing miles of storm drain pipe and over 14,000 manholes, inlets, storm drain structures, et cetera, that we have to maintain and keep up. So maintenance is this huge and really important part of storm drain infrastructure that is often forgotten about. But we have a really great staff here in-house that manages that for the city. In addition to that, we also have these various impairments that were designated or identified by our state DEQ and EPA associated with excessive fine sediment, bacteria, and polychlorinated biphenyls. And associated with those water quality impairments, we also have these other projects that we're working on. And our list there is somewhere in the $150 million range as well. So we've got a whole lot of work to be done. A couple of ways that we are actually implementing these solutions. So one of the things that maybe you all have heard of is green infrastructure. The idea is that we essentially use natural processes to try to mitigate flooding and improve water quality here in the city. So the photograph there is a picture of the Lick Run stream restoration at Washington Park. The idea is that we would provide a little bit more floodplain capacity, kind of like what you saw in the bench cut photo, but also that these projects can filter out pollutants that are in the waterways and provide a sort of aesthetic and recreational benefit to the community as well. So they're really cool projects, and we're kind of always working on building those. As I mentioned, we've got a great capital projects and maintenance team that's building and maintaining thousands of structures and storm drain pipes and so forth. So we kind of refer to that as traditional gray infrastructure. We also do a good deal of public education and outreach. So we as a team realize that our sort of objectives of flood mitigation, water quality, and ultimately making our community a great place to live, work, learn, and play, there's not enough of us and not enough hours in the day to do all of it ourselves. We really need the public's buy-in to help us with that. And so we have a lot of different really cool projects that we are engaged in to kind of work with our citizens. Finally, we spend a decent bit of time looking at local ordinances just to make sure that they're sort of supporting our broader efforts. We need to make sure that the zoning ordinance and various other aspects of our local rules are in support of reducing flooding and water quality and so on and so forth. And so we spend a good deal of time here at the utility looking at that sort of thing as well. So that's actually all I have for today. I'm going to turn it back over to Danielle and open for questions. Hopefully we have some.
Yes, thank you, Marcus. So a couple questions that we do have. So thank you again. It's always very interesting to get the overall of flooding in Roanoke that people just don't really realize. So kind of thinking of like next steps. So what do you, or what can you really share about what next project will be coming down the line to reduce the flooding here in Roanoke?
Yeah, that's a good question, Danielle. So we're really focusing on our tributaries these days. So I didn't really zoom in on them, but we have 13 tributaries that flow through Roanoke City, and they all drain into the river. And as we work on flooding in the valley, or at least in the city of Roanoke service area, we're looking for various stream restoration locations that we can provide additional floodplain capacity, as I mentioned in one of the slides. And so we have a couple of those projects that are currently like in the construction phase. There's a couple more of them that we're still sort of in the planning phases of it. But in the next couple of years, we're going to have a lot more of those types of sort of in-stream restoration projects, constructed wetlands that will be built in the area next maybe 10 to 25 years or something like that. So we're doing a lot of that in addition to some of the ongoing projects that I showed, the capital projects. And one thing that I forgot to mention that I think is important is in the next couple of weeks, you guys will have an opportunity to see some more particulars of what the various local governments are doing to mitigate flooding in our areas. So I know next week some of our partner agencies will be presenting on their local efforts. I think in week number maybe 3, we're going to be presenting on some stuff that we're looking at for downtown. So I tried to stay pretty general with this presentation, but stay tuned and you'll get to see some more specific projects that we've been working on to address flooding here in the valley.
Perfect. So yeah, we have a couple more questions piling in. So yeah, please just send your comments and we'll go through them. So up next, with urban development leading to higher runoff, is there a benefit / value of establishing parks, green spaces throughout the city?
So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Was that the end of the question? Sorry, Danielle.
Yeah, that's it. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Great question. And so the answer is yes. When we talk about park spaces, and in particular, when we have so turf is helpful, but really tree canopy is where we get a really big lift in terms of stormwater capture and stormwater treatment. And so we're kind of always working with our Parks and Rec folks to try to create these really great recreational spaces, but also these spaces that help to capture stormwater, treat stormwater, that sort of thing. So the answer is yes. That's a good question.
All right, up next, why is there not an effort to create more green spaces in downtown Roanoke?
That's a good question, and it's a prompting question. You'll have to stay tuned. I think it's week number 3. Is that right, Danielle?
That's correct. So yeah, that's when we're going to talk about so kind of like, yeah, stay tuned for that presentation because they're going to dip into that about the mitigating the downtown flooding and what projects can be done in that area because it's a lot of businesses too. So stay tuned. So next question, does the stormwater utility also deal with state or federal regulatory requirements within the stormwater utility program? And how does that influence your projects?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So one of the state and actually federal regulatory programs is the EPA's municipal separate storm sewer system permit. So that's really a permit that's focused on water quality and the ways that we as a city are required to keep our waterways clean. But when we start looking at projects, we're always looking for projects that provide co-benefits. So that means not just flood mitigation, but also water quality benefits, recreational benefits if possible. And the MS4 program, the permit that I just mentioned, what that has really done is we're responsible for that as well. And so we're always looking at our projects with these multiple benefits in mind, if that makes sense. We're trying to create flood mitigation capacity, but we're also trying to improve water quality at the same time. And some of that is driven by our MS4 permit, for example. We also have a couple of other total maximum daily load requirements that I won't get into the weeds on that, but in the slide that showed the water quality programs, we have those in mind as well. So we've got these water quality regulations that we're addressing, and then also flooding, and it's all kind of mixed together to in the same program.
Excellent. So this kind of goes back into more kind of like downtown, but see if you can kind of touch on this question. So how is the inspection / assessment of the underground infrastructure in downtown coming along? Are there any projects targeted for improvements on that as downtown growth continues?
Yeah, so the answer is we're working actively on identifying sort of the best possible projects to address the flooding issues in town, and also The previous question was about green space, and so we're trying to integrate those two things, right? It makes sense for us to be taking those multiple things into consideration. When it comes to inspection of them, that's the recurring thing that the city is, we do that as part of another program, but we have the system pretty well mapped out, and we pretty well understand the hydraulics or the way that the system flows at this point. And so we're using that information to really inform our planning efforts to address some of those issues that you've asked about. So.
Perfect. See if there's any more, but another quick question. So you addressed the 175-year flood event for the flood of 85, and I know with the flood reduction project, so kind of like what defines like the flood event? Because those are kind of like, it seems like obscure numbers for like years and things. Yeah. So if you could just kind of break that down.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if that was you that asked that or one of our viewers, Danielle, but there's a super nerdy answer to that question. It's really a statistical way of looking at river flow. And without getting into the details and trying to sketch it out here on this presentation, essentially what those numbers mean is if we measure flow in the Roanoke River for a long period of time, which we actually have, we have 100 and some odd years of measurements there at the Walnut Avenue Bridge. Sort of the river scientists can tell us with some measure of certainty how frequently a given flood is likely to occur. And so those years, sort of 25-year, 100-year, 175-year, those are sort of metrics of frequency. They're a way of telling us how likely is a given flood to occur. So a 500-year flood is a exceptionally rare flood. It's a very, very large one, but in any given year, it's very unlikely to happen because of how large it is. Whereas a 5-year flood is much more likely to happen in a given year. I think it's important to understand that a 100-year flood can happen in consecutive years. It doesn't necessarily mean if you have a 100-year flood tomorrow that you won't have another one in even a week. It's essentially just a statistical way of talking about river flows and probabilities and that sort of thing. It can be a little bit messy to try to explain it, but hopefully that's given you enough information to answer the question.
Yes, thank you, Marcus. So it doesn't seem like any more questions have come in, just an additional comment that I would like to share. So it's awesome to see a beautiful city with a beautiful river being so proactive. Great work. So I would definitely reiterate that. So thank you, Marcus, for doing today's presentation as we kick off the first one of the Tuesday Talk series. So I don't see any more questions coming in. So we'll kind of finish out. This recording will be published on Facebook and our website for our Prepare-a-thon month. So kind of getting prepared, knowing about flood risk and what to do. I already mentioned this is a 4-part series. So the next one will be September 15th at noon, and that'll be Roanoke County and the town of Benton. So we encourage you to tune in for that or share with some friends that maybe live in this area, since this was very city oriented. So reaching out to learn more about what the county and Benton is doing as well. So thank you, Marcus. Do you have any other closing comments?
That's it. Thanks for the opportunity to present to you all.
All right. Thank you so much. All right, everyone, have a great day.